Hello and welcome once again to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer, and we continue today with our series of interviews of notable freedom fighters on the scene working to defend human rights and the principles that have made Western civilization great. Today we have the privilege of having with us Christine Williams, who is a journalist, columnist, and the winner of 9 international awards as a Canadian talk show host and television producer. She is currently the Public Affairs and Media Consultant for the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, in Canada, and is on the Anti-Semitism Task Force for the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies, on the Board of Governors for the Gatestone Institute, on the Board of Advisors for Muslims Facing Tomorrow, and is currently working on a book exploring Islamic reform. Christine has done a great deal of work in the areas of diversity and multiculturalism. And welcome to you, Christine Williams. Thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Robert. It's a privilege to be on.
Well, we are here to discuss today the churches and Islam, and that is a very hot topic in light of something very interesting that has just happened just a few days ago. The Pope, Pope Francis, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, issued a statement in which he said, now, of course, it has to be borne in mind in the first place that it was a very lengthy statement. This was not the focus of it. But he said, more or less in passing, that authentic Islam and the proper reading of the Quran reject every form of violence. And this is, of course, a very common view among Christian leaders today. Do you think, however, that it is necessarily a productive or accurate view?
Robert, when I look at a statement like that, the first thing I think about, and I know we can be very technical about it, but the first thing I think about is the intent of which it was said. And when we look at what the Pope's intention was, if you look at his history, he's a man that tries to move toward peace and reconciliation and so forth. And when we look globally, sadly enough, because I also work, in fact, with in the area of racism, and we see two sides of the coin. One is racism, the other side is radicalism. And these are the two forces that we're dealing with today, and they are very difficult to balance simply because racism does exist on one side of the fence. I've heard of many cases where a woman wearing a head covering, and I have to say a head covering because I don't agree at all, and maybe we can address this later, in a face covering. But if she's wearing a head covering and she's Muslim, she may face antagonism in the streets, name-calling, stereotypes and so forth, without even knowing what this woman can be deep down inside. She may very well be peace-loving Muslim and advocate for our Judeo-Christian democracy. But on the other side, there is radicalism. And because the Church and the Pope seek to promote peace, these are the kinds of words that often come to the forefront, and they do have a dangerous meaning in them, in the sense of putting out there Islam as being particularly peaceful, when we both know, Robert, that the violent texts of the Quran are what rules every Islamic state that we see today, and in fact is used when we look at even what we're facing in North America as well as Europe when it comes to security issues and violence overall in terms of jihad and even self-jihad.
Well, this is exactly why I have a problem with his statement. Obviously, no innocent person should be victimized, and I understand if he is trying to promote peace, but I don't think that peace can be reliably achieved on false pretenses. And to pretend that the Quran and Islamic doctrine are something other than what they are, I don't see that as counterproductive, but also it has to be borne in mind that the Pope's statement is part of a much larger initiative among Christian leaders that has been broadly termed Chrislam, that is an attempt to bridge the gap between Christianity and Islam to promote peace. But I believe that, if I'm correct in my understanding of this, that it's also based on similarly false pretenses. Is that correct?
I say that it is. And if we look at the history of Christianity overall, it's based on peace. The sad thing about it is truth is often a sacrifice, if I dare say that, in terms of what Christianity represents as it applies to the word truth and so forth. Now, from the Christians that I know, the Christians that I've spoken to that espouse that same dangerous line of thought that there is no problem, everybody is peaceful, once they smile at you, once they declare they want to be your friend, we just embrace them and we just close our eyes to any kind of a truth out there when it comes to even genuine warning. I find that a very dangerous premise, and it is one that is permeating the world today because everybody wants peace. But people seem to not want to consider what the realities are. In fact, I heard a very simple but brilliant statement that went like this: when the truth seems too far-fetched, people often choose to close their eyes and not believe that it is the truth. So it's the easy way out to say, look, we accept everybody in the name of peace without realizing what the dangers actually are.
And what are the dangers? What exactly could happen if, say, the Pope or some Catholic bishops or some Protestant leaders, any kind of Christian leaders were to sit down with imams and they talk about peace and they say, we know really that Islam is peaceful and the Quran rejects violence. What harm is done? It's not true, but what exactly could be the consequences of this kind of thing?
Robert, the consequences and the dangers they're so long. We can talk about this for 2 hours, but I will give you some. For example, and this is where I'm going to introduce Israel as a topic here. I've been noticing recently that one can hardly talk about the issue of Islam without Israel being introduced into the equation. And to make it simple, the reason is, when we look at Israel, it is the epitome of freedom. It represents the same type of a democracy that we have here in the West, in the Middle East, and in fact is the only country in the Middle East that respects human rights and that stands by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When we take a look at the surrounding Arab states, the Muslim states that are governed by Sharia law, in other words, governed by Islam and the literal text of the Quran, these states all advocate overall the obliteration of Israel. I mean, we talk about the peace process, but we look at the Palestinian Authority Charter, we look at the Fatah Charter, the Hamas Charter, which all calls for the obliteration of Israel. Even when the PLO was established, it was written right from the beginning in their manifesto that the reason for the establishment of the PLO is for the liquidation of Israel. When we look at what we espouse in the West, freedoms for all, for blacks, for every race, for women, it is a very different system of government that we see throughout the Middle East and throughout Muslim countries. And here's the very danger, because your question was pertaining to the churches. The churches are very fundamental in our culture, in our society. There's a deep root when it comes to looking at the churches. Even our education system, as much as people try to turn a blind eye. You look at Harvard University, it was once a Christian university. The entire system is rooted in a Judeo-Christian democracy, so that now that certain types, those that espouse a stealth jihad as well as a violent jihad, they're changing their ways. What they're doing is they're using this peace that's advocated by the Christian church as a window, as a door to walk into, to climb into in the name of peace, and say that they want peace when that is not what they're out for at all. They're out for conquest of the West. And I know that people say that this is far-fetched, but it is not. There are documents that have been uncovered by various governments, the Swiss government, the US government, even in the Islamic Maghreb, and it states very clearly how stealth jihad is intended to work by infiltrating the West in whatever way is possible. Sadly enough, the Christian churches are very naive and they're very open-minded when it comes to accepting anything that might look peaceful when in fact it is not peaceful.
Okay, so are you saying then that this dialogue, these meetings where the Christian leaders affirm that Islam is peaceful, that aside from being false, it's actually aiding and abetting, however unwittingly, this plan of conquest or this Islamic supremacist imperative to subvert the West?
In many ways it is. I mean, if one has any idea what the Islamist project is about, and they have read any information whatsoever about it, I mean, I'm challenging every viewer to go and look at the Islamic project and see what it's about, see what it contains, because it is all about infiltration. So the churches are indeed aiding and abetting. It may not be intentional. People differ across the board. Some are genuinely naive, and I've spoken to those leaders that are genuinely naive, but the intent is there. And with that being said, not every Muslim is out towards the goal of stealth jihad. For example, right here in Ontario, Sharia law came very close to coming into Ontario in 2003. And there were Muslims who were very much against that process. And they fought the Ontario government, and thank goodness it was never allowed to come into Ontario. So not every Muslim is like this. But at the same time, churches need to wake up and smell the coffee and realize that not because somebody smiles at you, because they want to have a dialogue, means that they are genuine about dialogue and that they do believe in our system of human rights.
Well, that actually reminds me of an incident that happened several months ago when I myself was scheduled to speak at a Catholic conference in Worcester, Massachusetts. But the bishop there, Robert McManus, canceled my appearance, and he said this, and I quote, "Talk about extreme militant Islamists and the atrocities that they have perpetrated globally might undercut the positive achievements that we Catholics have attained in our interreligious dialogue with devout Muslims." So in other words, he's saying if we talk about the Muslim persecution of Christians with these Muslims with whom we're having dialogue, the dialogue won't go so well. Well, then one does wonder, what is the purpose of the dialogue in the first place, if not to protect these people who are being harassed and persecuted?
That question is a very large one, and it is heartbreaking how so many Christians do the lip service when it comes to the persecuted Christians. They're not there on the front line seeing what's being done, the heinous crimes, the viciousness that's being committed against our fellow Christians overseas. They acknowledge it because they think they have to acknowledge it. For example, there's a persecution day, a recognition day of Christians that are persecuted, and people seem to give a lip service. Now, I know that some may say I'm being judgmental by saying so, but when it comes to somehow digging our heels in to accept the truth of what is being done to Christians overseas and who is doing it, we tend to fall very short. And I think it's a shame, Robert, because I do follow Jihad Watch. I do follow exactly what you just mentioned there, and I see the marginalization of those who are fighting for our freedom, who are fighting for a genuine Judeo-Christian democracy where blood went into creating our culture, our society, and its freedoms, where people from overseas are coming here to escape the very oppressive regimes. Yet when they come here, many of them are trying to change our system, and we're sitting back all in the name of peace. Yes. And if there's time, I'd like to mention, of course, when you're ready for it, the United Church of Canada.
Well, go ahead. I was just wanted to say one thing, though, before we go on to that, and that is that when you mentioned these rather perfunctory persecution days that are held to raise awareness about the persecution of Christians, I've found that all too often, particularly when they are sponsored in churches, that there's a great reluctance to name who exactly is doing the persecuting. And even the Pope has done the same thing in recent meetings with Eastern Catholic bishops. He has decried, and patriarchs, he has decried the persecution of Christians in the Middle East without ever identifying the persecutors. And I wonder, does he think that they'll go easier on the Christians if he doesn't name them and call them out? Certainly, it's remarkable that his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, had condemned the bombing of a church in Egypt, whereupon Al-Azhar University, the foremost institution in Sunni Islam, Al-Azhar in Cairo, actually broke off relations with the Vatican and said, there'll be no more dialogue since you have disrespected us in this way until you affirm your respect for Islam. And Benedict never did that, but Francis immediately did affirm his respect for Islam and renew the dialogue. But then one wonders, well, what is to become then of these Christians who are being persecuted? Apparently no one can speak about them, or if they do, they can't speak about why exactly this is happening and what can be done about it. So I expect that quite a bit of this is going on in the United Church of Canada as well. Is that right?
Oh, it certainly is. It certainly is. And we all know that if there's an illness, and we simply call an illness without getting to the roots of why that illness is taking place, then there's going to be no cure for that illness. And sadly, this is what we're seeing happening here in our country, all through the West, through Europe. We've seen what happened in Europe. And going to the United Church of Canada, this is an example of what I see taking place in the churches. There was a working group that was set up in the United Church of Canada back in the summer of 2012. And this working group, surprisingly, was only 3 people, but they were sent on a mission of peace and justice and truth and reconciliation to look at the situation that's happening in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors. What they found, and let's not forget here, they're talking about peace and reconciliation, but in their investigation, they talked about and described Israel as being the occupier, the aggressor, the thief. These are the kinds of terms they use to describe Israel. And eventually, that working group, as well as the administration of the United Church of Canada, decided to go ahead and adopt as a policy limited boycotts and divestments against Israel. Now, there were those that were very embarrassed as a result of this. In fact, I talked to many United Church ministers. Some of them felt helpless because they said, look, this is not how we feel. It seems like there's a small group of people that have an agenda and they have hijacked the church. And they were appalled by what they saw. In fact, many of them, because I was involved in an outreach for Simon Wiesenthal at that point, many of them said, well, what about nations like China? What about nations that oppress Christians across the globe? Why isn't the working group pointing to those particular countries? Why aren't they even pointing out what the Islamic states are doing to Christians and to their own women? But no, they decided to demonize Israel, just as was done in Durban 1, Durban 2, and 3, demonize Israel, single out Israel, which is actually a freedom-loving country, and somehow brand it an apartheid state. Now, some people try to say, well, the limited boycotts and divestments really won't touch Israel. But it isn't even the issue of how much it touches Israel from a point of view of dollars and cents. It delegitimizes Israel, and it solidifies in the eyes of the world that label about being an apartheid state, which is totally untrue. And this is what we see in the churches. Sometimes I wonder what's the reason for this, and it's difficult to pinpoint any particular reason because in some cases it's genuine ignorance, in some cases follow the money, and in other cases it's just an issue of, well, Israel's rich, the Palestinians seem poor, so therefore one must be the oppressor and the occupier because the news says so. And so it's ignorance that we're looking at. But when all is said and done, the United Church of Canada adopted this. It created division in that church, so much that there were 2 reverends that I know that made news. One is Reverend Andrew Love that I spoke with. He stood against the ranks of the church and was marginalized in that church. And another one was Reverend Kurt Richardson. The 2 of them seem to be the lone voices. They do have some support, but they are the outspoken voices that are being attacked by their very church for standing up for truth and justice.
Well then, if these people are being attacked for standing up for truth and justice, well obviously I suppose their opponents would say, well no, you're really standing up for oppression and so on. But don't these people who are passing these kinds of resolutions have any awareness of, for example, Hamas and the genocidal television shows that are constantly broadcast on Hamas television, the ugly demonization of the Jews, the recurrence of ancient anti-Semitic tropes like the blood libels and the hauling out of the protocols of the elders of Zion? Doesn't this bother these church leaders at all?
I'll tell you something, Robert, and I'll give you an example, and I'll call a name here. There's a reverend, a leader, that's one of the heads in the Lutheran Church, and his name is Robert O. Smith, and he wrote a book called More Desired Than Our Own Salvation. He is the head of the ecumenical dialogue between the Palestinians and the Israelis for the Lutheran Church. And he is very instrumental in Africa as well with the Lutheran Church, as well as his position in America. This man wrote a book, the same book, More Desired Than Our Own Salvation, criticizing, demonizing Christian Zionism, and virtually exonerating Islam and stating that there is a preference for Israel, no questioning toward Israel and its occupations. In fact, he does his book very cleverly because what he does is that he quotes people throughout his book that are very pro-Palestinian, very anti-Israel, and he builds a case against Christian Zionists, pointing out people like Falwell and many of the Christian leaders that we see who refer to Scripture, so much, in fact, that some even say, well, they're a little bit flaky. And he seems to dig his heels in to some of these quotes to discredit a lot of these preachers like John Hagee and Falwell and other ministries to make it look as if they're not asking any questions. All they care about is the Bible said so. What the man leaves out is the truth of what is in these charters that I mentioned, with the Palestinian charter and, in fact, all of the charters surrounding, and what the agenda really is concerning Israel. And this is the kind of a person that we see as a head in the church. In fact, many churches support this targeting of Israel, and they have this white guilt where they feel, well, we need to stand up and be good to these other people because of colonialism and slavery and the sins of the past, where the common person out there, the common person that's attending the churches, they have no idea that slavery is still going on to this day by Arabs in places like Mauritania. They don't realize the extent of oppression toward women, the cruelty, the child brides. And yes, they hear about it here and there, but they read headlines, and it doesn't seem to interest them to get into it, because the easy way out is to go to church, sit in the pews, listen to the leaders, and hope that they're telling you the right thing.
It's incredible to me, though, that nobody ever challenges these Christian leaders on the reality of the jihad and shows them some of this material that we see all the time of even the youngest children being indoctrinated into hatred and the will to violence by Palestinian leaders. It would seem as if some of that would give them pause. I don't understand it. Is there no one who speaks up and challenges these people within their own groups?
There are those who stand up and challenge, and I would think the biggest challenge that the church should be challenged to do is, if they care about others, and as Christians, we're supposed to care about everyone as a human being. If the challenge is that by calling it for what it is branding a particular race or a particular religion, then why not call it for what it is, and at the same time keep on saying that not every Muslim that you see is going to espouse that kind of a hatred and violence. But we certainly need to stand up to the challenge and get the truth out there. Sadly enough, I wrote an article quite a long time ago, actually, that addressed the two siblings that work together, racism and radicalism, because those that are truly racist, they're the ones that cause others to say, oh, we don't want to be like those racist people. I'm talking genuine racists, because there are those. But the problem is people like yourself who call it for what it is, who try to warn the West of what is taking place. We're seeing it throughout Europe. They're not heeding the warnings. They're calling people like you a racist, and you are not racist, without actually looking at what racism actually means. And racism certainly does not mean calling it like it is in terms of the truth. It means being antagonistic towards somebody by way of their race and by way of their particular belief. And this is not what's going on at all for people who are trying to warn the West and warn the churches what is actually taking place.
Well, of course. I mean, after all, what race is jihad terror and the Muslim persecution of Christians? There are Muslims of all races who have gone, for example, to Syria to wage jihad there and have been involved in the destruction of churches there and the terrorizing of Christians. This is not a racial issue at all, but I understand that this is the primary way that Christian leaders in the West are intimidated into holding to this position and to thinking that to speak out against Islamic jihad terror and Islamic supremacism would be somehow wrong for them to do. Is that correct?
I agree with you, Robert. There's something else I'd like to mention that I find is a stain to our culture in the West overall, particularly those who are so quick to scream racism, that we're a racist country if we call out what's going on in the Islamic State. It almost seems to be the worst kind of racism to not call it out. It almost seems like there's a double standard between judging what we deem to be good and what we deem to be evil. So, in other words, it's okay for those brown people in those Islamic states to attack women for trying to get an education and throw acid in their faces. It's okay for them to stone women who were raped. It's fine for them to have that kind of a law in their land. And even when they come here, it's okay to subjugate their women according to the Quran. You can slap them and put them in their room. It's okay for them to do so. It's okay for them to have their women all dressed in black, covering their faces in scorching 90-something, 100-degree weather, but it's not okay for our women in this country. I worked in a shelter for abused women, for battered women, and it's interesting how when one looks in the West at what constitutes abuse, the feminists in our country, if a man so much as says something derogatory to his wife or his girlfriend, abuse. It's always abuse. And there seems to be this man-hating kind of an ideology that has permeated our society when it comes to these radical type feminists. And it even permeates in areas that are not so radical because we are a nation that we respect women's rights. So why is it that we cannot respect women's rights when they happen to be Muslims? Many of these Muslim women, like abused women, will not come out and take a stand against these men because according to their religion, they must be subjugated. They're made to be subservient to men, inferior to men, even abused by men, and to do what they say without question. So why is it that this kind of abuse is being allowed in our country as a difference? Because it's okay for those brown people, it's okay for those Muslims to be that way toward their women, but we won't dare tolerate it for our women. Where are the feminists in our country when it comes to these very unfair and unjust issues that are right in front of our eyes?
Well, it seems to me when you frame the issue in those terms that you're really saying that the leftist feminist establishment in Canada and in the U.S., probably in Western Europe as well, is deeply racist itself because they hold these double standards and they wouldn't dare to enforce their own understanding of human rights and women's rights on Muslim women, on Muslim men, and call them to account for it because it's their culture, as if they cannot be expected to live up to universally accepted norms of human rights.
Absolutely. They turn a blind eye to the abuses that are taking place, lest they be termed racist themselves, which to me, what they're doing is a horrible form of racism and lack of compassion and lack of caring. When it comes to the true meaning of caring, why don't we care about women that are subjugated? Why are we not caring about our persecuted brothers and sisters overseas? Why is it that we have one standard for one and we continually turn a blind eye to the other? And these are questions that we need to be addressing as a nation. And I keep on saying, Robert, that you're doing an excellent job, and we need to be dealing with this from the ground up. Because if we look at how society is going, the direction it's taking, if we look at many leaders in various camps, political leaders globally, we keep on saying, follow the money. We look on the campuses, what's taking place, the infiltrations by Saudi Arabia, by Iran. Those countries have a lot of money, and money influences. There are a lot of leaders that are being influenced by power and by money in the churches as well as government. And as far as I can see it, when we do go out and we do educate people from the ground up, there seems to be more interest there. And the more we can get people to understand what's taking place and to educate people, then they can start calling their leaders into accountability.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And we are coming now to the halfway point. This is a most interesting, most fascinating discussion, really, about the capitulation, essentially, of the Christian churches in the West to the grim reality of Islamic jihad and their unwillingness to speak about the problem honestly and various other attending issues. We will have much more of this right after these important messages with Christine Williams from the International Christian Assembly of Jerusalem and Robert Spencer with Jihad Watch. We'll be right back after this. Thank you. And we're back. I'm Robert Spencer with Jihad Watch, and we're here with Christine Williams of the International Christian Assembly in Jerusalem, speaking about anti-Semitism in the churches, Islamophobia, all sorts of very important issues. And first, I wanted to ask you, Christine, International Christian Assembly in Jerusalem, what exactly is that?
The International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem was actually began in 1980 when Jerusalem was finally declared the capital of Israel. It caused offense, of course. I mean, what else can we expect? And 13 nations left their embassies, closed up in Jerusalem. That was when the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem was formed to support Israel. It started out as an outpouring of support for the existence of the state of Israel according to scriptures and also according to logic and fairness and truth about what was taking place and what has taken place historically. It has since evolved into some 70 countries worldwide, their offices. The International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, Canada is one of them. And we also do programs in Israel and have been, such as Aliyah, very much sponsorship of that particular program, returning Jews to their homeland. A large amount has come from Russia. Also, the Holocaust survivors, many of them, like any country, Israel has its poverty. I mean, we have this view of Israel, of being all of these rich oppressors in the world. Nothing can be further from the truth. Every country has its poor, has its own issues to deal with. And some of the Holocaust survivors do have problems when it comes to the economy, when it comes to their own survival and losing their families and so forth. So we work with many organizations like Yad Vashem to try to help locate them, but we also provide um, um, places for them to live. We have sponsorships, and we have a residence in Israel that houses Holocaust survivors, where we have special dietitians there. They're given special treatments, get their hair done, and they're looked after well. Another thing that we do is that we do work at reconciliation between Arabs, Christians, and Jews, and we're unwavering in our support for Israel as a state. So our outreach is truly a Christian outreach that embraces people in general. We care about people. We love people as is commanded according to our beliefs as Christians. But at the same time, we uphold the truth of what's taking place in Israel.
Well, that's excellent. And the Israeli government, what is their stance toward all this? How do they receive your efforts?
The Israeli government has been absolutely wonderful with the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. In fact, this January, we have a pastors' leadership conference coming up in Israel, and Knesset will open their doors wide open to us. We have had a very close relationship with the Israeli government. In fact, the Feast of Tabernacles, most people have heard about the Feast of Tabernacles because it is the largest tourism draw in Israel annually, and it is actually the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem that sponsors that particular event. So Israel is very grateful. The tourism industry is, as well as the government. We've been very well received.
And is this a Canadian organization, or is it an international organization in terms of its sponsors as well?
It's an international organization, and it originated in Jerusalem, but it has 70 different chapters in various countries globally. So
Excellent.
Canada is just one of those chapters, and we work very closely together with the head office in Jerusalem.
I see. And have you had any kind of interaction with these Christian leaders who condemn Israel?
Well, sadly enough, those always do exist. Personally, and looking at the leadership that we have with the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, maybe it's because we're so unwavering in what we believe in Israel as a state. We are considered an organization that stands for Israel.
Yeah, what I mean is, have you had interactions or debates? Have you had discussions with these Christian leaders who hate Israel? Yes.
I'm sure historically we have, but when I look at the leadership here in Canada, and this is an organization I've not been with for a long time, we have not had any open confrontations. I do speaking engagements in certain churches, and I certainly welcome people that may have questions and debates, but so far it's been good because we stand for what we stand in, and for those who don't agree, they attack Christian Zionism overall. But to say that I personally know of our leadership here in Canada that's been attacked by other leaders, I haven't seen it happen. I know of leaders that don't support Israel the way we do, but they tend to leave us alone.
I see. So, but when you go to these churches and you make these presentations, what kind of a case do you make that they should be supporting Israel?
I'll tell you, one of the first questions I ask the audience, because when I go into the churches, I'm not always sure where that audience stands in terms of its knowledge over all of what's taking place. So what I would do as an example to be able to explain that question adequately to you is I'll ask questions. How many of you have heard of IAW? And sometimes, or in fact, I'll phrase it the other way. How many of you have not heard of IAW? How many of you have not heard of BDS? How many of you believe that the Palestinians have a historic biblical claim to the biblical heartland? And depending on how many hands go up, I realize what level of knowledge I'm dealing with, and I go from there. And when people question, I answer the questions, and I answer it very candidly. And it doesn't end up antagonistic simply because I think when we're faced with people one-on-one, and this is something I've done on talk shows that, in fact, did get antagonistic at times, when we're faced with questions that involve the truth, we don't need to hide from the truth. You'll notice, Robert, that people who tend to attack you are those who are cowards. They'll attack you in the media. They'll say nasty lies about you. They'll spew all kinds of accusations against you, but often when they're challenged to a public debate, they often cower. And when they do decide to engage in a debate, when they're faced with a question, they just simply don't answer, or they use up airtime and lots of words. They just go on to take up the airtime because they really have no answer to give you, because there is none, because they know that they're lying. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of one particular fellow that this was very telling, that I interviewed on a talk show when we featured Geert Wilders. I asked him the question, and he belonged to the Islamic Society of North America. I said, look, do you believe that you should have the right in our democracy to criticize Muhammad? Immediately he started to attack Geert Wilders. I said, no, we're not talking about Geert Wilders here. We're talking about you. And I'm asking you a question. Do you think you should have the right to say something about Muhammad that is negative if you chose to do so? He took up a good 5 minutes trying to get away from that question. And then eventually he says, well, he doesn't want to attack Muhammad. I said, look, I did not ask you whether you want to attack Muhammad. I don't even want you to attack Muhammad. I'm asking you, do you feel that you have or should have the right to say something derogatory about Muhammad if you wanted to right here on our show? He looked at me with the worst vicious look, and that was the end of the program. And I said, thank you for your answer, because you just gave one. And that was the end of the show.
But wouldn't he then accuse you of Islamophobia? Aren't you being Islamophobic to ask questions like that?
He can accuse me of that in a public forum. I'll be glad to answer him.
Well, how would you answer? If somebody says, look, Christine, all that you're doing is Islamophobic. You're just demonizing Muslims and carrying water for this oppressive apartheid state, and it's all Islamophobia. How would you respond?
I would say, look, you're talking to Christine here, and I'm not talking right now with that question that you just asked me. I'm talking from a human point of view, not on behalf of anybody at this stage. I'm a Christian. I care about people. If somebody comes to my door in trouble, I don't care what race they are. I don't care what they believe in. I will help that person. And I have done so. And I will continue to do so. I will continue to give a cup of cold water to people who are in need. But it does not mean that if I see something taking place, somebody getting attacked out there, and I don't care by who it is, it doesn't mean that I'm going to turn a blind eye because I may be called Islamophobic or because I may be called whatever phobic. The truth is the truth. And there are those that are suffering in a horrible way in Islamic states. Our Christian brothers and sisters, as well as Islamic women, there are people suffering, and we seem to turn a blind eye to that suffering and turn it around to make it look like we're the ones that have the phobia, simply because we care about those who are suffering in these states. And we care about what went in to the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and into the creation of the West as Judeo-Christian democracy.
It is a very canny tactic because it does deflect attention away from the worldwide oppression that is going on in the name of Islam and jihad, and tries to focus attention on us as speaking honestly about this issue, as if there's something wrong with that. And the effect of it, of course, is clear, that it intimidates people and scares them and makes them think that there's something wrong with opposing jihad terror, and that means fewer people will oppose jihad terror, no?
There's also a cultural problem that we see today. We live in a culture that we take the easy way out. We live in a dispensable society. Everything is, well, let's just take the easy way. That's just how we are as a culture. And because of that, we tend to just read headlines and we don't dig deep to find out what's really going on. It takes time for people to try to seek the truth. We're involved, okay, and I'm going to speak now from a point of view of Canada as a multicultural country. We are in a situation here where immigrants are coming in all the time, and we welcome them, and we should welcome them as people. However, if people are coming into our country and they don't respect our Constitution, they don't respect that this is Canada, and they need to become Canadian in the sense of respecting our Constitution and respecting one another and understanding equal rights, then we have a problem. But because we're faced with a society that takes the easy way out, and now the Middle East issues, which are rather complex, has through immigration come home to us, we're faced with a problem because there is no easy way out this time. We need to find out what is taking place. We need to educate ourselves, and it takes time. And because of the difficulties we face as a society, we often don't want to take the time to develop the knowledge. So peace sounds good, smiles look good, friendliness, we just accept it without really asking questions.
It seems as if in Canada, the primary way that the Canadian government, at least in the recent past, has opted to deal with the problem is to condemn those who speak honestly about it. For example, I'm thinking of the hate crimes charges, the hate speech charges that were recently brought against Ezra Levant and Mark Stein. Are those kinds of laws still on the books?
Those are the human rights commissions, and they have since been happily branded kangaroo courts. And if you'll notice, it wasn't just those that screamed against the truth of what's going on with violent forms of Islam and stealth, and as well as violent jihad. It was also against even a minister that we saw out west, Reverend Boissois. He was actually distributing flyers against gay activists. Now, his intention wasn't to condemn all gays, but the activist types that would go out there and recruit young boys into that lifestyle. As a minister, he felt that it was his right to warn people. So he went out and did it, and lo and behold, found himself slapped with a nasty human rights case on his hands and was shaken down by the Human Rights Commission. Boissois is his name. So for those who might want to look that up, they'll see how that went. Interestingly enough, the group EGAL, Equality for Gays and Lesbians Everywhere, they eventually came to his defense. And an article came out talking about the unlikely bedfellows between those two. And the reason why they came out is because they said, hey, if his free speech is being tampered with, we're all going to be next. So from the free speech point of view, I think Canada has done pretty well. When I did the daily call-in talk show, I had a lot of left-wing media that will also be with us on the show, and they actually supported free speech in this country. Many of them were no fans of Ezra Levant, and they will be quick to call certain people like yourself, Robert, and others Islamophobic for calling it what it is. But when it came to the issue of the kangaroo courts and free speech, they were pretty stern about that. And I have to say, without bias, that I'm quite impressed with the current government that we have, because they have an understanding of what's going on. And I wrote an article for the Gatestone Institute where I did an interview with Jason Kenney, who was Citizenship and Immigration Minister at the time, who pointed out his understanding of the various cultures that we're dealing with and the challenges that we're facing in Canada, which is not easy given the level of immigration of this country.
Well, that's, I have to commend certainly the Harper government for standing with Israel at a time when Barack Obama is abandoning it and betraying it again and again. I'm glad to hear these things. Certainly, I can say from my own experience, I was in Canada in September, gave a number of talks all across the country.
We're banned.
Didn't get arrested. So
that's something about our government, Robert.
It's a step up. But in any case, I suppose in the last few minutes that we have now, what I'd like to know is there an intersection between your work, for example, with Simon Wiesenthal and with the International Christian Assembly? I mean, I remember the great historian Batya Orr, the pioneering scholar of dhimmitud, the institutionalized subjugation of non-Muslims under Islamic law, writing very, very forcefully about the need for Christians and Jews to unite and work together as facing the same foe, as facing the same situation under Islamic law, that of dhimmitud. And unfortunately, it seems as if, as we discussed earlier, there is a rise in anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism or anti-Israel sentiments within the churches, rather than the kind of coming together that we need to see. And perhaps that's to be expected in light of the general denial of the reality and the nature and the magnitude of the jihad threat. But in any case, is there any kind of cooperation of that kind? Are you working toward it? Do you see it in other ways, and so on? Hello? Have we lost the sound? Are you there? Oh, well, it looks as if we have lost our guest. So we'll be trying to get her back, but in any case, in the meantime, as I was saying, as I was asking Christine, in fact, the problem that seems to be all too pervasive in the world today is that among Christians and Jews, there is an ongoing antagonism, and certainly the reality, historic reality, and the horrific reality of Christian anti-Semitism cannot be denied. And that's understandable that it would give rise to suspicion. And at the same time, it persists and thus gives rise to ill will among ignorant and ill-informed Christian groups, or malevolent ones for that matter. But the problem is that the reality of jihad mandates the subjugation of both groups. And that is thus the reality that, for example, in the Quran it says, "Fight against those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book." And that's the Quran's designation for both Jews and Christians, as well as others like Zoroastrians and so on. Until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. And so, in other words, what we have is a mandate to subjugate Jews and Christians under the rule of Islamic law, make them pay this tax. This is not a verse cherry-picked out of a Quran full of verses of peace and reconciliation. It is, unfortunately, a linchpin of Islamic law to this day, that it is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community to rule and to subjugate the Jews and Christians in this way. Now, Islamic law is not fully enforced in the Islamic world today, but that is what the jihad groups are fighting to do, to restore precisely that kind of stipulation. So we've seen jihad groups recently, in recent years, in Iraq, in Syria, even Hamas in Gaza and others, say that once they've consolidated their power, they intend to impose the jizya, to subjugate, that is, the Christian populations, make them pay this tax, and deny them basic rights. Also in Iraq, we've seen calls for this. And so the Jews and the Christians face the same fate. They face the same foe. They face the same problem. As we were discussing before the connection was lost, with so many luck on restoring that connection? In any case, as we were discussing, it is unfortunately the case that because of the general ignorance of the existence of things like that Quran verse and others like it that call for this subjugation, it's all too often that people are fighting the last war. Both Jews and Christians are suspicious of one another rather than coming together to face this common threat. And what's even more ironic about this is that, for example, in the historic reality of dhimmitude, the Muslim overlords would make sure to set antagonisms among the Jewish and Christian communities so that they would not work together and they would be angry and suspicious toward one another. And that same kind of thing is happening today. I understand that we've restored the connection. Is Christine Williams back? Well, we're hoping that she will be soon. I thought that you told me she was. Okay. Anyway, the initiatives like the International Christian Assembly in Jerusalem, I think, are precisely the kind of thing we need to accomplish exactly that, and to bring about that kind of reconciliation in the first place between Jews and Christians, and then a common collaboration to help them to fight together against the jihad threat. Here we are. Christine, are you back?
Here we are. Back on.
Excellent.
Finally. Yeah,
Well,
lost connection there.
I've just been giving this long monologue about...
Apologies about bad connection.
well,
I'll
my
have to give-
question was about the two parts of the bio that I read at the beginning. You say that you are part of the Anti-Semitism Task Force for the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies, and also public affairs and media consultant for the International Christian Assembly in Jerusalem. What I was asking was, do they work together? And my long monologue just now was about the need for Jews and Christians to collaborate and cooperate with one another against this common jihad threat. So is there cooperation of that kind, or do you see it elsewhere?
Yes, there is. There certainly is cooperation, and I'm delighted to say that that cooperation is building. Simon Wiesenthal is an organization that has been big when it comes to outreach. They recently started the Tour for Humanity, which is an attempt to get all people together, just in the name of humanity, that respect human rights, that recognize Israel's right to exist, and that do manage to share that common ground when it comes to humanity. And of course, that includes Christians. And there has been an outreach to Christians from Simon Wiesenthal. So some of my work in that domain does overlap. I'm finding that more and more we're seeing that here, that groups are indeed overlapping and trying to join efforts in order to get it out there that we are an admirable nation that respects human rights, that Israel does the same, and that Israel does have that right to exist. And even the organization that I'm on with Muslims Facing Tomorrow, this particular organization comes out in the open and says, we respect Israel's right to exist. We live in a Judeo-Christian democracy, and we are not to be messing and meddling with the Constitution. And they are strongly against any kind of an establishment of Sharia law, even when it comes to family arbitration, as we saw that almost took place in Ontario. So there is that collaboration with Christians and Jews, but also there are some Muslims too that are trying to support the effort to recognize Israel and support what we stand for as a nation.
Well, that's really amazingly great. This Muslims Facing Tomorrow, it sounds like quite an interesting group. I mean, I remember that it was remarkable that it was Muslim women's groups, as I recall, is that right, that fought against the Sharia initiatives in Canada back a few years ago.
The Muslim Canadian Congress was the lead group on this, and a couple of the women there, Rahil Raza was one of them, there was another, Ms. Hassan, they were very much involved in fighting this initiative, and they had other women that also supported that and said, look, we don't want Sharia law here. It's oppressive to women, and we don't want it in our country. And they fought against it, along with others that were against it. And that was the reason why the Ontario government decided to listen, because they found it quite disconcerting to have to deal with Muslim women coming out and saying, we reject that completely here in Ontario.
Yeah, that's really amazing when we consider that they probably, the multiculturalist elites in Canada were probably thinking, this is great, we'll please the Muslim groups, we'll secure their votes for our political initiatives and so on, and everything will be wonderful. And they never expected that it would have been Muslims themselves who opposed it. But it just shows that, as we've seen in Egypt now with the toppling of the Muslim Brotherhood government, there are millions of Muslims around the world who don't want to live under Islamic law, who prefer Western understandings of the way society should be ordered and Western notions of human rights. They don't want to see women oppressed institutionally. They don't want to see non-Muslims deprived of basic rights. They want the freedom of speech and the equality of rights for all. And so it's really unusual, however, to see any actually standing up, particularly in the West, and doing something about this. And that one instance in Canada was singular, remarkable, and to be commended.
Yes. Yeah. I'm happy that you're mentioning that, Robert, because these particular people, Muslims Facing Tomorrow, they're very pro-Christian, pro-Jewish as well. They're very eager to dialogue with Christians and Jews. And that is really the heart of what dialogue means. Dialogue has been taken, it's been corrupted, it's been hijacked. But really all dialogue means is, let's sit down together, let's be friends together. But you can't possibly be friends with somebody who wants to destroy you. And this is what Canada and other countries, Canadians, need to wake up and realize that not everybody who calls themselves your friend is actually your friend. But
I'm all for dialogue. I'm just not for dialogue on false pretenses. You know?
Absolutely. Well said. Well said.
Well, Christine Williams, it's been a most interesting hour, or about the 55 minutes we had of it. And in any case, thank you so much for being with us. We've been talking with Christine Williams of the International Christian Assembly in Jerusalem and the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. This has been Jihad Watch. I am Robert Spencer on ABN. Thank you very much for watching, and God bless.